Hi, I'm Matt McCormick at the Philosophy Department at California State University, Sacramento. My email address is mccormick@csus.edu. The next address there is my philosophy course website, and finally is my blog address, www.provingthenegative.com. Today, I'd like to reconstruct and explain William Lane Craig's argument for the existence of God, that's known as the Kalam cosmological argument for God. Cosmological arguments in general have some features. There's a whole family of these arguments that have been around for centuries, and we can identify them because first off, they talk about first causes. So they typically argue for some first cause for the universe, and they will employ some form of the principle of sufficient reason, something like every event or fact must have some cause or explanation for its existence. You've got to have a principle like that in there to get to the conclusion in these arguments. And usually these arguments will involve some kind of denial of infinity. They are typically trying to argue that the series of events reaching back into history for the universe can't be infinite. That is, there must be some first cause, some foundation upon which all the rest, the subsequent events, rests. So one famous example from Aquinas, we won't discuss this one today, but you may be familiar with it. Aquinas said something like, the universe either goes back infinitely or there's a first cause. If it goes back infinitely, then there would be no first cause by definition of infinite. But if there's no first cause, then there'd be no effects now. We wouldn't see the outcome or the results of these causal chains surrounding us right now. But there are effects around us now. Therefore, there must have been a first cause, which is God. Now, this argument has got a couple of famous problems or mistakes in it, but these arguments resurface and they come up in different versions, and Craig's argument has been quite popular and influential, at least amongst non-philosopher circles in the last part of the 20th century. Craig has been promoting this argument for a while, so we're going to consider this one. And it's quite a simple argument, at least deceptively simple on the outside. So Craig's principle here, principle of sufficient reason, is whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Three simple lines. Now, just a cause to the universe is not enough to get us to God. What we need is to defend this claim. Philosophical analysis reveals that such a cause must have several of the principal theistic attributes, and that would give us the conclusion that the cause of the universe is God. Now, this argument puts Craig into company with particular groups of American believers and not with others. We've considered that the vast majority of Americans falls into one of these four categories. They're either naturalists, maybe about 15%, people who don't see or believe that God had anything to do with the advent or the unfolding of the events in the universe. And then there's people at the bottom here, young earth creationists, who hold that the earth, life, humanity, and everything on the planet was created in more or less its current form within the last 10,000 years. So these are biblical literalists who are subscribing to some kind of Genesis literal account of creation. Those folks number in the perhaps 40% in American population. And another 40% of Americans have some kind of compatibilist view here in the middle. They're Big Bang theists is what I've called them, or Big Bang and intelligent design theists. And Craig is signaling that he's somewhere in this group. These folks will acknowledge the 13.7 billion year history of the universe, and they'll acknowledge the Big Bang as the origin of our universe, and they'll acknowledge perhaps evolution starting about 4.2 billion years ago on Earth, but they will maintain that God had something to do with all of that. God pushed the button on the Big Bang, or God crafted and guided the process of evolution intelligently and crafted things to get the outcomes that we see around us. So Craig then is what we're calling a Big Bang theist. He acknowledges the 13.7 billion year history of the universe that starts with this singularity on the left-hand side, a moment of infinite curvature, infinite energy, and infinitely small space that then is followed by a period of rapid expansion in the first few picoseconds of the universe that then rapidly cools and separates, and matter forms, and the physical laws as we know them precipitate out of that explosion. And ultimately, billions of years down the line, on the far right is our time slice of the universe. And on Craig's view, he's suggesting that God was behind that Big Bang singularity event. Okay, so he's going to give an argument for that conclusion. He needs to give arguments for the premises, and there's only two premises in his argument. So Craig takes the first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, to be obvious and uncontroversial. We can find no exceptions to this claim. It appears to be true on conceptual grounds. It just makes perfect common sense that something cannot come from nothing. So Craig doesn't spend a lot of time, at least in the article we read, defending the first premise. It turns out that this claim is controversial. There are events that occur without causes, we're told from quantum physicists, and there are examples of things that come into being from nothing, like quantum particles, possibly even the universe, and there's a growing consensus here where physicists like Lawrence Krauss here, who argued last year in this book, A Universe from Nothing, are arguing that Craig's first premise is actually false, and in fact, the universe unfolded out of nothing. And I'll just point you to that book to try to figure out some of the details on how that works. Okay, so Craig now needs to argue for his second premise that the universe began to exist. Now, on the basis of empirical evidence from astronomy and cosmology, we believe that our universe emerged from the Big Bang. Craig, in effect, is trying to give a conceptual argument for roughly the same conclusion. He wants to show that the universe started on the basis of a priori and conceptual reasoning. So he's going to give an independent argument for the same conclusion. This would corroborate the findings of astronomy and cosmology, it would seem. If we ask astronomers these days, however, and they are being very careful, they will say that the Big Bang is the point at which we can go no further in our empirical astronomical investigations into the origin of the universe. If we ask someone like Stephen Hawking, was there a cause or something beyond the Big Bang, he'll say, well, we don't know. They are open to the possibility, but our current methods and state of science has shown that to be the case. Now, when we look at arguments like Richard Swinburne's design argument in this course, we saw that there is a live hypothesis and a growing number of people discussing something called the multiverse, which is thought to have been a prior state of natural affairs that had prior conditions that produced and led up to the Big Bang. So the multiverse theory would seem would also run contrary to something that Craig is suggesting here, if Craig is suggesting that everything starts with the Big Bang. However, if Craig is correct, he will establish that there must be a finite starting point where it all begins, and if he is successful, he'll show that God is the cause of that starting point. Now, he does this conceptually here, not by looking through a telescope, but doing it conceptually by arguing that an actually infinite series or number of things cannot exist. To support premise 2, Craig is going to argue that you can't have actual infinities. If this is true, then there can't be an actually infinite number of events in the history of the universe, so there must be a first cause. So what we're doing here is we're considering two scenarios, two possible descriptions of the universe. Maybe we got to now by way of an infinite series of events receding back into the past, or maybe we got to now by way of a long series of events that starts with the first cause. That's really all there is. Now, there's a famous joke about this situation where a little boy asks his dad, well, what does the earth rest on? And his dad says, well, that's a very clever question, son. The earth rests on the back of a turtle. And then the kid asks, being clever, well, what does the turtle rest on? And he says, that's an even more clever question, son. It's turtles all the way down. So now we've got this notion that it's turtles all the way down in order to describe an infinite regress. And what Craig is going to try to do is argue that it's impossible for it to be turtles all the way down. What are the turtles resting on? There's got to be something back there in the history of the universe where it starts. There has to be some rock bottom, some foundation upon which the whole thing unfolds. All right, so now before we can move on, we need to separate some kinds of infinities before we can understand this argument. So one kind of infinity is an actually infinite series or set, and this is an existing set of things that is infinite in number. So despite whatever cognitive dissonance you might have about it, just imagine that we have a set that currently has actually an infinite number of things inside of it. Now, you can't count those off, you can't conceptualize those, but suppose, hypothetically, imagine conceptually what that would be. So an infinite number of things. By contrast, we can certainly imagine potentially infinite series. A potentially infinite series is a collection that is increasing towards infinity, but never actually gets there. It's a series that can have new members added to it indefinitely, but it's not itself actually infinite. So it currently has finite numbers, and there's a pool of things outside of it, an infinite pool of things that we just keep moving into the set and adding. So we keep adding and can do so indefinitely. So that means that lots of things are potentially infinite. There's potentially infinite number of humans on the planet. There's a potentially infinite number of atoms or whatever in the universe. And finally, there's infinity, the South Korean boy band, the last category of infinite things in our series. All right, so now Craig can give his argument. Craig's argument is going to employ what's come to be known as a reductio ad absurdum strategy. Now, in this strategy, what we do is we assume the opposite of that which you would prove, and then you argue that the assumption generates a contradiction. An actually infinite set or series generates a contradiction, says Craig. So the idea is that if I want to prove X, well, I assume not X. And then if I can deduce or produce a contradiction out of not X, then it must be that X is true. If you can show that the opposite of your conclusion is contradictory, it makes no sense, then you can undermine it and prove the thing you're trying to prove. Now, Hilbert's hotel, this example that we're talking about, comes from David Hilbert, a famous mathematician. And he had devised a thought experiment to illustrate the counterintuitive properties of infinite sets. Hilbert intended to show not that infinite sets were logically contradictory, but that there were some features of infinite sets that violate our ordinary expectations and intuitions from dealing with finite quantities. Now, Cantor's theory of transfinite numbers is thought by mathematicians to have resolved the seeming paradox generated by Hilbert's hotel, and we're going to consider this paradox in a second. Craig, however, appears to be trying to show that the hotel, trying to use the hotel to generate a logical contradiction. And here's how the argument goes. So here's the reductio ad absurdum strategy. Consider an actually infinite set of rooms in a grand hotel that are all occupied. So imagine we had an actually infinite hotel with an infinite number of guests currently in all the rooms. Now, since infinity is infinity, it would be possible to do this bizarre thing. It would be possible to move the guests to an even-numbered room, making an infinite number of rooms empty, and possible to add an infinite number of new guests. That is, I can take a full hotel, no vacancy, infinite number of rooms, infinite guests, and I can now add an infinite number of new guests to that room because of this peculiar feature of infinity. How would you do this? Okay, so suppose I want to vacate room number 1 and get the guy who's in room number 1 into room number 2. No problem. I take the guy out of room number 1 and I move over and I put him in 2. But there's a guy in room 2. So what do I do with him? Well, that's not a problem. I take him out and I move him out to room number 4. Well, then what do I do with the guy who's in room number 4? I take him out and I move him out to room number 6. And now I can keep doing this because there's not a point at which we run out of rooms here. It's an infinite number of rooms. There's no room at the end of the hall where when I get to that room and I pull that guy out, I've got nowhere to put him. I've always got somewhere else to put the guy who's in the whatever even-numbered room you find. I just move him up to the next room. And I displace that person up to the next room because there's an infinite number of rooms. Now that's crazy, right? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, well, here's how Craig is going to tease out the so-called contradiction. So the number of guests before the arrivals, the new arrivals, is infinite. And of course, the number of guests after the new arrivals is infinite too. So what we've established then is that the number of guests before the new arrivals is equal to the number of guests after the new arrivals. And there Craig's done it. There Craig has got the sentence with the contradiction in it, the sentence that says that we've got a married bachelor or a triangle with four sides, or we've said A and not A. We've said that two things are equal when in fact they're not equal. So E makes the contradiction explicit. But the number of guests before the new arrivals is not equal to the number of guests after the new arrivals. So the hypothesis that generated this crazy migraine-inducing mess, the hypothesis that an actually infinite series is possible, generates a contradiction. Our hypothesis back at A must be mistaken because of the contradiction it generates at E. All right, so Craig thinks that Hilbert's hotel shows that actual infinities are impossible. How? Well, any hypothesis that generates a logical absurdity is itself impossible. Therefore, an actual infinity is impossible because we just generated that contradiction. So that means no South Korean boy band, and that means that actual infinities are ruled out, and that means that the universe had a beginning. An actually infinite number of things can't exist. We can't have an infinitely receding series of events back into past. A beginningless series of events in time entails an actually infinite number of things. So we were considering this scenario, remember, of the two scenarios. Either it goes back indefinitely on the left there, it goes back to a first cause. But we've just ruled this one out. A beginningless series of events, a series of events with no first cause, it would be an actually infinite series of events between now and then, and that's impossible, so that can't exist. Now, a common question that comes up here and in lots of these conversations is, well, what caused God, or what caused this first cause? It's a perfectly sensible question. And here's Craig's answer and many theologians' answer to it. Notice that Craig has chosen this principle as sufficient reason. Craig has said everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, what's open to Craig and Aquinas and people advocates for the cosmological arguments to say now is to say, well, God didn't begin to exist. That principle applies to everything that comes into being. But God's a necessary being. God's always been. God is an uncaused cause. God is something that's always been, so this principle doesn't apply to God. All right, next question. Do we have any reason to think that the first cause is God? Craig thinks we do. On the basis of our argument, he says this cause would have to be uncaused. We've shown that. It would have to be eternal. It didn't ever come into being, so the only other alternative is that it's eternal. It's got to be changeless, timeless, and immaterial. It's outside of the material, spatial, temporal world that we occupy. So we've already got several of the principal theistic properties. Now, furthermore, Craig says it would have to be a personal agent who freely elects to create an effect in time. And Craig gives a sophisticated argument for this conclusion, but here's the basic idea. In our experience, from what we know, there's only two kinds of causes. There's mechanical, natural, physical causes in the world. So when you add an acid to a base in a chemistry class, you get an explosion. That is the result of chemical, natural laws. And we've established that whatever causes the universe itself is outside of the laws of physics. So it can't be one of those. Now, the only other kind of agency or causal efficacy that we know about are personal causes. And this one you know intimately because this is the one that happens when you raise your hand or you turn your head or you elect to do something. You are exerting your causal force in the world and making something happen, and that's originating from your mind or from a free choice. These are the only two kinds of causes we know of, and since we've ruled out that the first cause of the universe can be a physical, material cause, then it must be a personal cause. So Craig then says, perhaps a bit prematurely, therefore, on the basis of the Kalam cosmological argument, I conclude that it's irrational to believe that God exists. All right, so in conclusion, what have we shown? Craig has presented a logically valid argument, and he has given arguments for the premises, so it would appear that the conclusion is sound. He said, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Furthermore, philosophical analysis reveals that such a cause must have several of the principal theistic attributes. Therefore, the cause of the universe is God. Now, this argument has been controversial and generated a lot of objections. There's a number of complaints that philosophers, physicists, astronomers, and theologians have had to this argument. Craig has defended it at great length, and there's a vast literature on this discussion. Next time, in the next lecture titled Objections to Craig's Kalam Argument, we will consider several of these objections that allege to undermine the argument we've just seen.